When Leia was 8 years old, her entire world collapsed. It began with a phone call on a soggy Tuesday, and all of a sudden she was merely a memory keeper and no longer a daughter. She moved in with her grandmother Evelyn in a quiet apartment tucked between rows of old maple trees in northern Oregon after her parents were killed in a car accident, leaving her small and silent in a world that suddenly felt too big with nowhere else to go. Evelyn did her best. She baked Leia's favorite cookies, told her bedtime stories, and held her close at night. But grief is a way of slipping through cracks no matter how tightly we try to seal them. The apartment was safe, quiet, but it was also full of echoes, and none of them sounded like love. Evelyn had raised children, lost friends, buried a husband, and realized that grief couldn't be fixed. It could only be carried. However, every morning as she sipped her tea and listened to the rain tap against the kitchen window, the apartment had grown too quiet and still. That weekend, Evelyn took Leia to the Hillside Animal Sanctuary because she decided she needed a friend, someone who would sit next to her quietly without talking to her, someone who wouldn't attempt to fix her, just be there. They were all hungry for attention as rows of barking dogs greeted them, but a big German shepherd sat silently at the other end of the shelter, his fur darker than storm clouds. His ears were alert, but his eyes were holding something gentle. Knowing that Leela had stopped in front of his cage, the dog lowered his head and approached the bars slowly while softly pressing his nose through the question, "What's his name?" Leela didn't say anything. Instead, she squatted down and peered into his eyes. "Rusty," Evelyn inquired, "has been through a lot and doesn't warm up to just anybody," the attendant said. But Leia was already reaching out, her tiny hand resting against Rusty's fur through the bars. He didn't move away. They brought him home that afternoon. He didn't bark or jump or run wild. He simply lay by Leia's feet as she read a book on the couch, his breathing steady and calm like he'd always belonged there that night. For the first time in weeks, Leia fell asleep with her hand resting gently on Rusty's back. Rusty didn't ask for anything. He didn't demand walks or whimper for attention. He simply existed beside Leia, a quiet shadow, steady and patient. In the mornings, he would wait by the door, tail thumping softly against the floor. When Leia shuffled out of bed after school, he would meet her at the door, his body wiggling with a joy he barely showed anyone else. In the evenings, he would curl up at her side as she worked through her homework, his head resting on her toes. Slowly, Leia's walls began to crumble. She found herself talking to Rusty, whispering secrets into his ear as she braided his fur with clumsy little fingers. She giggled softly when he snuck treats from the kitchen or chased his tail in slow, lazy circles. On sunny afternoons, they sat together on the front steps. Once an empty shell of grief was starting to fill with tiny sounds again, the stream of the floor as Leia danced barefoot. Rusty's head rested on Leia's knee as she read stories aloud to him. Evelyn looked from the window as her heart tightened with bittersweet relief. Rusty was more than just a pet. He was a piece of safety stitched into her world, a silent protector, a living, breathing promise that even when life felt broken, something gentle could still grow from the cracks. At first, it was easy to explain away the rustle of pages turning, the occasional soft bark, and Rusty dreaming beside her. Grief still clung to the edges of their lives. Some nights Leia would cry into Rusty's fur until sleep took her, but now she wasn't crying alone. Leela started having dull headaches that surrounded her temples like a fog some mornings. She stayed in bed longer. Her limbs were heavy, and she wouldn't open her eyes. Evelyn assumed it was another episode of her dreams. Grief resurfacing in her sleep, she told herself it was normal. But then Leia stopped eating as much. She pushed her food around her plate, said she felt tired all the time. Her cheeks looked paler, her spark dimmed. And Rusty, he wasn't himself. Either the dog that once leapt to his feet when Leia reached for his leash now rose slowly, almost reluctantly. He still followed her from room to room, but there was no bounce in his step. His tail, once a metronome of joy, now only twitched from time to time. Evelyn noticed the change, but old habits die hard. It's the weather, she muttered one chilly morning, wrapping Leia in her scarf. Rain always makes us sluggish, but deep down something didn't sit right. One afternoon, Leia fell asleep on the couch, her book slipping from her fingers. Rusty lay beside her, his breathing slower than usual, his eyes barely open. Evelyn watched them both with unease, two beings growing quieter, slower, dimmer. Still, there was no fever, no cough, no clear reason to panic, just a creeping sense of wrongness that settled like dust in every corner of the apartment. And as the days slipped by, both Leia and Rusty seemed to fade a little more like sunlight retreating behind a storm cloud. After over 15 years of teaching second grade, Miss Alvarez was able to spot problems when a child's eyes dimmed for reasons unrelated to math problems or conflicts in the playground. After class one afternoon, Miss Alvarez called Evelyn and said, "I don't mean to worry you, but I think Leia might be more than just tired." She had always been quiet since starting her class, which wasn't new, but lately she had become quieter. She still fell asleep during reading time, resting her head on her folded arms, barely touching her lunch, and her handwriting, which had been neat and careful, now trailed off halfway through sentences. Evelyn hesitated because she had been experiencing some unusual headaches lately. Initially, I assumed it might have been the time of year, but when Miss Alvarez paused and Rusty mentioned that he hadn't been feeling well either, Evelyn paused. She had dismissed Rusty's fatigue as being similar to Leia's, but hearing it from someone else who wasn't affected by grief made it sink like a stone into her chest. Following the call, Evelyn sat on the edge of the couch and stared at the heater vent across the room. The air hummed softly through it, as it always had, but this time, the house was too quiet. Because she was so exhausted, Ola went to bed early and didn't even complete her book, which was a nightly ritual for her. Around midnight, Evelyn woke up from a quick snooze in her recliner while Rusty curled at her feet. The TV was buzzing softly in the background, but it wasn't the sound that woke her up. Rather, it was a low, urgent whine Rusty sound. She stood slowly and followed the noise down the hallway as she reached Yela's room. The whine turned into a soft bark, barely more than a breath. Rusty was at the side of the bed, paws up on the mattress, tugging gently at the blanket with his teeth. "Rusty." Evelyn whispered. The dog turned to her, his eyes wide and desperate. He let out a sharper bark and looked back at Leia, then to the vent near the floor. That's when Evelyn noticed Leia's face was pale, her breathing shallow, her small hand still rested on Rusty's back, but she didn't stir. A chill ran through Evelyn. She moved fast. She opened the windows. She pulled Leia into her arms, calling her name, until the girl blinked slowly, confused, as if waking from underwater. The air inside the room felt thick, wrong, not smoky, not warm, just off. And Rusty, he wasn't tugging the blanket to play. He had been trying to pull her out. By morning, Evelyn was done guessing. She called Frank, an old friend now retired, who had once been a heating technician. He still tinkered with machines in his garage, always happy to help. When something didn't feel right, "Come quick," she said, voice tight with worry. "Something's wrong in this apartment." After arriving within an hour with his toolbox in hand and his breath visible in the chilly morning air, Frank nodded briefly to Evelyn before moving from room to room, feeling the vents and inspecting the furnace, while carrying a small handheld sensor near the heating ducts. When he got to Ila's room, he stopped when the sensor started beeping, first softly and then loudly, and he said to Evelyn, straightening slowly, "You've got a problem." What sort of issue was the carbon monoxide causing her stomach to drop? Grimly low levels, but steady. That's worse in some ways. You wouldn't smell it or see it, but it's enough to make you sick, especially if you're a child or a dog. All at once, Evelyn's knees almost gave out. Carbon monoxide, the silent killer. The headaches and exhaustion were all signs that made sense. Leia's episodes of fainting. The air itself had been slowly poisoning them night after night. Frank's voice broke through her thoughts. "You can't stay here until the leak is fixed. Open every window and get out." Evelyn didn't argue. Instead, she gathered their coats, packed a few necessities, and scooted away. Rusty had blamed the weather, grief, and even their diet for their lethargic behavior. Leia slept for almost 12 hours that first night, and when she woke up, her eyes were clearer, her cheeks held color again, and Rusty, who had hardly moved in days, stood on wobbly legs and nudged her hand with his nose. The doctors confirmed what Frank suspected was low-level carbon monoxide exposure. Rusty followed his slow but steady steps as they stepped outside, and the cold air hit her like a wave. It was sharp, clean, and full of life. And for the first time in weeks, Evelyn felt like she could breathe. Evelyn couldn't stop thinking about that night, the sound of Rusty's alcohol, and how he had attempted to drag Leia from the bed he had known one afternoon as sunlight shone through the windows. It wasn't enough to kill them, but it was enough to gradually wear them down. Leia was sitting on the rug with Rusty's head in her lap. She caressed his ears and said, "Thank you." scarcely raising her voice above a whisper. Rusty didn't say anything in response, but he moved closer, rubbed his body against hers, and sighed softly in satisfaction. Evelyn stood in the doorway, hand over her heart. She didn't need miracles, she didn't need answers. She had Rusty at school. Leia had always kept her world small. She didn't run at recess. She didn't raise her hand. She didn't join in when the other kids laughed too loud or played too rough. It wasn't that she didn't want to, it was just that something inside her had grown quiet, like a door slowly closed after too much loss. But something changed after. Rusty had started small. Leia, drawing pictures of him in the margins of her notebooks, writing little poems about his soft ears, and how he always waited at the door when she came home. Then came the day she asked to bring him for show, until Rusty sat beside her, tall and still, his calm presence grounding her like roots in the earth. That was the first time the class heard her voice carry through the room, clear and steady. He doesn't talk, she told them, but he understands everything. Weeks later, after everything happened, the discovery, the escape, the healing, Miss Alvarez asked Leia if she wanted to share her story. So she did. She told the class about how she met Rusty and how he didn't bark or jump. Instead, he just sat and watched her. How she didn't talk to him for the first few days, but he never left her side. How she began whispering things to him that she couldn't tell anyone else. And how he saved her, not with a heroic leap or a loud bark, but by nudging, by pulling, and refusing to give up on her. The class sat silently listening, not just because it was a depressing tale, but because Leela told it to show them that sometimes love doesn't look like we expect. Sometimes it comes quietly on four legs with soft fur and eyes that see everything. The story went beyond the classroom. The school ordered carbon monoxide detectors. A local news source published an article about silent bravery instead of tragedy. And each picture as tall and composed as on the first day back home. Rusty sat next to Leela. Evelyn observed her granddaughter conversing with reporters, educators, and even fellow pupils. "You gave him a home," she said one evening while caressing Ila's hair, her voice still kind but firm. "And he gave you the world back." When Rusty was curled up at her feet, Leia glanced across at him and didn't immediately respond. "No," she said, "hate to give me myself back." The apartment felt different that night. The silence was lighter and the air was fresher. Leela was lying in bed with Rusty curled next to her as usual, his warm breath rising and falling with hers as she reached down and threaded her fingers through his fur. "You're still here?" she whispered, smiling, and Rusty didn't move because he didn't need to be there. The moon shone softly outside the window, casting a soft glow over the room. It wasn't the house she had first arrived at, which was empty and filled with grief, but now it held warmth, safety, and love. When Leia closed her eyes, she realized how much she had lost. But in Rusty, she had discovered something equally potent, a reminder that love never goes away. Even when people do, it lingers and saves. Sometimes the purest love doesn't require words, and other times it has four legs, a beating heart, and the silent bravery to pull you back from the brink.